Your mother is unconscious on the highway. I don't know who you are, but this number is labeled Guardian, and I didn't know who else to call. 5 seconds of silence met her. It wasn't the silence of a man in grief, but the cold, heavy silence of a predator calculating his next move. Cassie Miller was 24 years old, her joints aching from a 12-hour shift, kneeling on the vibrating asphalt of the I-95, while the blurred light trails of speeding cars whipped her hair across her face. And the voice that finally cut through the static made her blood turn to ice. Do not call the police. Do not move her. And do not, under any circumstances, let a single soul see your face. She should have dropped the phone and run. She didn't. If this is your first time here, welcome to the fold. Hit subscribe and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story of power and protection reaches. Now, let's go. Cassie Miller had a survival instinct honed by years of living on the edges of a city that didn't care if she ate. She had a rule about the highway at 2 a.m. You don't pull over. Not because she was heartless. She was the opposite of heartless. She was a woman who would give her last dollar to a stranger and skip dinner to do it. But 3 years of working as a maid in the city's highest glass towers had taught her that certain shadows are deeper than others. She knew the difference between a person in need and a trap that would erase her from existence. She knew that difference like the rhythm of her own heartbeat. And then, she saw the woman, and she broke her rule. The victim was lying near the guardrail, a fragile figure in a silk dress that looked like a ghost against the black tar. It was the jewelry that stopped her, a diamond brooch so bright it seemed to cut through the dark. It was completely wrong for this roadside. Completely wrong for this world. Cassie knew power when she saw it, and she knew that the woman bleeding onto the asphalt was the kind of treasure men started wars over. The air in the Volkov boardroom was thin, chilled to a precise 68 degrees and heavy with the scent of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Roman Volkov sat at the head of the obsidian table, his silver fox hair catching the dim light of the recessed LEDs. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man of tailored vests and calculated silence. But beneath the crisp white cotton of his shirt, the jagged lines of a dragon tattoo crawled up his neck, a permanent reminder that he had climbed to this height over the bodies of those who mistook his elegance for weakness. Across from him, 3 men from the North Side Syndicate were sweating, despite the air conditioning. They were arguing over shipping lanes, their voices a low drone that Roman barely acknowledged. He was watching the steam rise from his untouched espresso, his mind already 3 steps ahead of their pathetic attempt at a power grab. Then, the vibration started. It wasn't the frantic ring of a socialite or the persistent buzz of a business associate. It was a rhythmic, heavy thud against the marble tabletop. Roman's hand, steady as a surgeon's, reached out. He saw the caller ID. Private Secure Line 01. His heart didn't skip a beat. It hardened. That line was linked to a single location, a high-security estate tucked into the rolling hills of the countryside. It was a sanctuary lined with bulletproof glass and patrolled by men who were paid more to stay silent than most men made in a lifetime. It was the only place on Earth where Lydia Volkov, the woman who had birthed the dragon of Bisusin, was supposed to be untouchable. He tapped the device, sliding it to his ear without a word of apology to the men across from him. Speak, he commanded. Sir. The voice on the other end was shallow, but with the sound of a punctured lung. The perimeter was compromised. They didn't come for the vault. They came for the madam. We couldn't. The line went dead with a sharp, electronic snap. Roman didn't move. He didn't gasp. He didn't roar. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness settled over him. The men at the table stopped talking, the air in the room suddenly feeling like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. They watched as Roman's furrowed brow smoothed into a mask of pure, lethal intent. He stood up slowly, the leather of his chair creaking in the sudden vacuum of sound. His eyes, usually a calm, piercing hazel, had darkened until they were almost black. He wasn't thinking about shipping lanes anymore. He was visualizing the security protocols of the safe house, the blind spots in the cameras, and the list of names of everyone who knew Lydia was there. The meeting is over, Roman said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that made the glass of water in front of the north side boss ripple. Volkov, we haven't settled the... Roman leaned forward, his palms flat on the obsidian. The monster, the dark ink at his collar, seemed to pulse. If you're still in this building in 60 seconds, I will assume you were part of the breach. And if you were part of the breach, your families will be looking for your remains in the Han River for the next decade. They didn't wait for a second warning. The room cleared in a frantic shuffle of papers and retreating footsteps. Roman remained, alone in the cold glass spire. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Panic was a luxury he hadn't allowed himself in 15 years, but now it was clawing at his throat, a raw, suppressed frenzy. Lydia was his anchor. She was the only person in the world who didn't look at him and see a predator. He pulled his phone back out, his thumb hovering over the tracking software for her personal medical alert pendant. The screen flickered to life, showing a pulsing red. It wasn't at the safe house. It was moving, fast, toward the city, before it suddenly jerked and came to a dead stop on a stretch of highway notorious for its darkness and speed. His phone buzzed again. An unknown number. He answered on the first vibration, his breath hitching in a way that would have shocked his enemies. Your mother is unconscious on the highway, a woman's voice whispered, sounding small, terrified, and bone-tired. I'm just a maid, please. You have to help her. Roman closed his eyes, his chest heaving as the controlled lethality of his life collided with a visceral, animal fear. He didn't know who Cassie Miller was. He didn't know she was a maid in an apron kneeling in the dirt. All he knew was that the miracle he thought he'd lost was breathing on the other end of a stranger's phone. Do not call the police, he rasped, his voice cracking with the first note of a madness that would soon burn the city to the ground. Do not move her. And do not, under any circumstances, let a single soul see your face. The wind on the I-95 didn't just blow. It screamed. It whipped the loose strands of Cassie's hair into her eyes and carried the biting scent of exhaust and burnt rubber. Every few seconds, the ground beneath her knees shuddered as a semi-truck roared past, a wall of steel and wind that threatened to suck her into the lane. But Cassie didn't move. She couldn't. Below her, Lydia looked smaller than any human should. The silk of the older woman's dress was ruined, dark stains spreading across the pale fabric like ink on a blotter. The diamond brooch pinned to her shoulder mocked the grime of the highway, catching the strobe light flicker of passing headlights. Stay with me, Lydia, Cassie whispered, her voice cracking against the roar of the traffic. Just stay with me. Lydia's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged, a terrifying, wet sound that told Cassie time was running out. Cassie looked at her hands, red, shaking, and useless. She looked at her phone, still gripped at her palm, the screen dark after that bone-chilling conversation with the man who called himself a guardian. Do not call the police. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only person holding the rope was a monster she had never met. With a sob of frustration, Cassie reached for the ties of her white apron. Her fingers fumbled with the knot, the fabric stiff with the grease and sweat of a 12-hour shift at the hotel. She ripped it free, the stark white cotton looking like a bandage against the black asphalt. She folded it with trembling precision and pressed it firmly against the gash on Lydia's forehead. I've got you, Cassie promised, though she didn't know if she was lying. I'm not leaving. Minutes felt like hours. The highway was a blur of uncaring motion, a river of people going home to warm beds while a queen lay dying in the dirt. Cassie's legs had gone numb, the cold seeping through her thin stockings, but she maintained the pressure on the wound. She focused on the rhythm of Lydia's heartbeat under her fingertips, a faint, desperate drumming that was the only thing keeping Cassie from screaming. Then, the sound of the highway changed. The steady hum of traffic was suddenly interrupted by the aggressive, synchronized growl of high-performance engines. Cassie looked up, squinting against a new set of lights. These weren't the yellowed beams of commuter cars. These were blinding, white LED arrays, cutting through the dark like searchlights. For black SUVs, their paint so polished they looked like shards of midnight, tore across the lanes. They didn't slow down. They swerved with lethal precision, forming a wall of armored steel around Cassie and Lydia. They effectively cut off the highway, their massive frames creating a sanctuary of silence amidst the chaos. The doors opened in unison. Men in charcoal suits stepped out, their movements so clinical and practiced they didn't seem human. They didn't look at the traffic jam forming behind them or the irate drivers honking their horns. Their eyes were on the girl in the apron and the woman on the ground. Cassie pulled Lydia closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt like a stray cat cornered by a pack of wolves. One man, taller than the rest with a jagged scar running along his jawline, stepped toward her. He didn't reach for a weapon, but the way he moved suggested he was one. "Step away from Madam," he commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the wind with the weight of an executioner's blade. I'm helping her," Cassie gasped, her hands still pressed firmly to the apron-turned bandage. "She's bleeding. You can't just move her." The man paused, his eyes flickering to the blood-soaked white cotton under Cassie's hands. For a second, his lethal mask slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine shock. He hadn't expected the maid to stay. He hadn't expected her to fight back. Before he could speak, a fifth vehicle, a low-slung, matte black sedan, slid into the center of the formation. The back door opened, and the air seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Roman Volkov stepped out. He didn't look like the man from the boardroom anymore. He looked like the god of the underworld coming to claim what was stolen. His silver hair was swept back by the wind, his tailored vest stark against his white sleeves, and his eyes, they were the color of a winter storm. He ignored his men. He ignored the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. He walked straight to the edge of the circle, his gaze falling on Cassie. He saw her disheveled hair, her pale, terrified face, and the way she was shielding his mother with her own body. He saw the apron, stained crimson, held in place by a girl who looked like she was about to break, but refused to let go. The controlled lethality in Roman's expression faltered. A raw, jagged emotion broke through his hazel eyes, an obsessive, terrifying gratitude that Cassie couldn't name. "You stayed," Roman rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. Cassie looked up at him, her eyes wide with visceral vulnerability. "You told me to." In that moment, on a blood-stained highway under the glare of a dozen headlights, the contract of Cassie Miller's life was rewritten. She had been the accidental hero, a bridge between worlds, and as Roman reached out a hand to help her up, she realized the highway wasn't just a road anymore. It was the beginning of a madness she would never escape. The transition from the wind-whipped chaos of the highway to the interior of the Obsidian Fortress was a descent into a world of terrifying, silent perfection. Cassie sat in the back of the armored sedan, her hands still stained with Lydia's blood, feeling like a ghost haunting a machine. The estate was hidden behind a wall of granite and weeping willows, a sprawling structure of dark glass and sharp angles that looked less like a home and more like a monument to isolation. As the heavy steel gates hissed shut behind them, Cassie felt the final thread of her old life snap. She was no longer a maid with a double shift and a rent deadline. She was a witness to a secret that men like Roman Volkov killed to keep. The car stopped in a courtyard paved with polished basalt. One of the charcoal-suited men opened her door, but he didn't offer a hand. He stood back, his eyes scanning the tree line, leaving Cassie to step out on her own shaky legs. Roman was already at the top of the wide stone steps, his back to her as he barked orders into a phone. His voice was a low, jagged vibration that seemed to command the very air to go still. "Bring the private surgical team to the East Wing. No logs. No external signals. If a single byte of data leaves this house, I'll burn the provider to the ground." He snapped the phone shut and turned. In the harsh, artificial light of the estate, the monster Cassie had expected was fully visible. The dragon tattoo on his neck looked like it was breathing, and his silver fox hair was disheveled for the first time, a single lock falling over a brow furrowed with lethal focus. He looked like a man who had just declared war on the world. "Inside," he commanded. Cassie followed him through the towering front doors. The interior was a cathedral of obsidian and shadow, illuminated by the cold, silver glow of recessed lighting. There were no family photos, no warm rugs, only the sterile chill of marble and the scent of expensive rain. As they walked toward the east wing, Cassie's heartbeat hammered against her ribs. She expected to be led to a cellar, or perhaps a room with a single chair and a bolted door where the questioning would begin. Instead, Roman stopped in front of a pair of heavy oak doors. He pushed them open, and the scent of antiseptic hit Cassie like a physical blow. It was a private medical suite, equipped with technology that looked more advanced than the city's best hospitals. Lydia was already there, a team of masked professionals moving around her with surgical precision. The frantic, wet sound of her breathing had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic hiss of an oxygen concentrator. Roman didn't go to the doctors. He didn't check the monitors. He stopped 5 feet from the bed, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that they were shaking. In that moment, the titan of industry vanished. The man who had threatened to burn providers and bury enemies was gone, replaced by a son who looked utterly, hopelessly lost. He stared at his mother's fragile form, the way her gray hair was spread across the white pillow, the way her skin looked like translucent paper, and a raw, visceral vulnerability cracked his mask wide open. "She's all I have," he whispered. The words weren't meant for Cassie, but they hung in the silent room like a confession. Roman didn't look at Cassie. He was looking at the woman he had spent his life building a fortress to protect, only to realize that the walls were never thick enough. He looked terrified, not of an enemy or a bullet, but of the silence that would follow if Lydia's heart stopped beating. Cassie stayed by the door, her apron still clutched in her hands, a white flag stained with the history of the night. She had expected a monster who would dispose of her once she was no longer useful. But as she watched Roman's shoulders heave with a suppressed sob he refused to let out, she saw something far more dangerous. She saw a man who was unraveling. Roman finally turned to her, his hazel eyes swimming with a dark, obsessive intensity. He looked at her blood-stained hands, then back at his mother, and the connection seemed to anchor him. He walked toward her, his presence overwhelming the small space, until he was standing close enough for Cassie to feel the heat of his suppressed panic. "You stayed when the world was roaring past," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "You held her together with a piece of cotton and a prayer." He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her face but not touching it, as if he were afraid his own darkness would smudge her. "I don't know who you are, Cassie Miller," Roman whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, frightening promise. "But you brought my heart back from the highway. And in this house, we pay our debts in blood or in gold. I think I'm going to choose something else for you." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. The accidental hero had just walked into the center of a dragon's den, and as Roman turned back to the mother he couldn't lose, Cassie realized that the Obsidian Fortress wasn't her prison. It was the place where she was going to watch a king drive himself to madness to keep her safe. The golden light of the medical suite was a sterile, unforgiving glow that made the blood on Cassie's hands look like rust. She sat on a low stool in the corner, her body finally beginning to betray her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the freezing wind of the highway was receding, leaving a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. She looked down at her ruined apron, then at her fingers, realizing she was still shaking. Across the room, Roman Volkov stood like a statue of obsidian. He hadn't moved since the surgeons had stabilized Lydia's vitals. He was watching the heart rate monitor, his eyes tracking the rhythmic green pulse, as if his own breath depended on it. The heavy, expensive silence of the fortress was broken only by the hum of the machines and the distant, muffled sounds of his men securing the perimeter. Roman finally turned his head. His piercing gaze didn't land on the high-tech equipment or the door where his generals waited. It landed on Cassie. He studied her, the way she shrank into her oversized uniform, the paleness of her face, and the stubborn set of her jaw. "You're still here," he said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of an anomaly. "You told me not to leave," Cassie replied, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. "And besides, I wanted to make sure she was okay." She looked so small out there. Roman walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just outside her personal space, the monster hint of his dragon tattoo peeking above the collar of his shirt. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal vest and pulled out a checkbook, the leather soft and dark. With a flick of a fountain pen, he scrawled a number that would have changed Cassie's life 10 times over. He tore the slip of paper away and held it out to her. "For your trouble," he said, his tone clinical. "And for your silence."
Cassie looked at the check.
She saw the zeros, the signature that carried the weight of an empire, and the sheer, arrogant. The car stopped in a courtyard paved with polished basalt. One of the charcoal-suited men opened her door, but he didn't offer a hand. He stood back, his eyes scanning the tree line, leaving Cassie to step out on her own shaky legs. Roman was already at the top of the wide stone steps, his back to her as he barked orders into a phone. His voice was a low, jagged vibration that seemed to command the very air to go still. "Bring the private surgical team to the East Wing. No logs. No external signals. If a single byte of data leaves this house, I'll burn the provider to the ground." He snapped the phone shut and turned. In the harsh, artificial light of the estate, the monster Cassie had expected was fully visible. The dragon tattoo on his neck looked like it was breathing, and his silver fox hair was disheveled for the first time, a single lock falling over a brow furrowed with lethal focus. He looked like a man who had just declared war on the world. "Inside," he commanded. Cassie followed him through the towering front doors. The interior was a cathedral of obsidian and shadow, illuminated by the cold, silver glow of recessed lighting. There were no family photos, no warm rugs, only the sterile chill of marble and the scent of expensive rain. As they walked toward the East Wing, Cassie's heartbeat hammered against her ribs. She expected to be led to a cellar, or perhaps a room with a single chair and a bolted door where the questioning would begin. Instead, Roman stopped in front of a pair of heavy oak doors. He pushed them open, and the scent of antiseptic hit Cassie like a physical blow. It was a private medical suite, equipped with technology that looked more advanced than the city's best hospitals. Lydia was already there, a team of masked professionals moving around her with surgical precision. The frantic, wet sound of her breathing had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic hiss of an oxygen concentrator. Roman didn't go to the doctors. He didn't check the monitors. He stopped 5 feet from the bed, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that they were shaking. In that moment, the titan of industry vanished. The man who had threatened to burn providers and bury enemies was gone, replaced by a son who looked utterly, hopelessly lost. He stared at his mother's fragile form, the way her gray hair was spread across the white pillow, the way her skin looked like translucent paper, and a raw, visceral vulnerability cracked his mask wide open. "She's all I have," he whispered. The words weren't meant for Cassie, but they hung in the silent room like a confession. Roman didn't look at Cassie. He was looking at the woman he had spent his life building a fortress to protect, only to realize that the walls were never thick enough. He looked terrified, not of an enemy or a bullet, but of the silence that would follow if Lydia's heart stopped beating. Cassie stayed by the door, her apron still clutched in her hands, a white flag stained with the history of the night. She had expected a monster who would dispose of her once she was no longer useful. But as she watched Roman's shoulders heave with a suppressed sob he refused to let out, she saw something far more dangerous. She saw a man who was unraveling. Roman finally turned to her, his hazel eyes swimming with a dark, obsessive intensity. He looked at her blood-stained hands, then back at his mother, and the connection seemed to anchor him. He walked toward her, his presence overwhelming the small space, until he was standing close enough for Cassie to feel the heat of his suppressed panic. "You stayed when the world was roaring past," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "You held her together with a piece of cotton and a prayer." He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her face but not touching it, as if he were afraid his own darkness would smudge her. "I don't know who you are, Cassie Miller," Roman whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, frightening promise. "But you brought my heart back from the highway. And in this house, We pay our debts in blood or in gold. I think I'm going to choose something else for you. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. The accidental hero had just walked into the center of a dragon's den, and as Roman turned back to the mother he couldn't lose, Cassie realized that the Obsidian Fortress wasn't her prison. It was the place where she was going to watch a king drive himself to madness to keep her safe. The golden light of the medical suite was a sterile, unforgiving glow that made the blood on Cassie's hands look like rust. She sat on a low stool in the corner, her body finally beginning to betray her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the freezing wind of the highway was receding, leaving a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. She looked down at her ruined apron, then at her fingers, realizing she was still shaking. Across the room, Roman Volkov stood like a statue of obsidian. He hadn't moved since the surgeons had stabilized Lydia's vitals. He was watching the heart rate monitor, his eyes tracking the rhythmic green pulse, as if his own breath depended on it. The heavy, expensive silence of the fortress was broken only by the hum of the machines and the distant, muffled sounds of his men securing the perimeter. Roman finally turned his head. His piercing gaze didn't land on the high-tech equipment or the door where his generals waited. It landed on Cassie. He studied her, the way she shrank into her oversized uniform, the paleness of her face, and the stubborn set of her jaw. "You're still here," he said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of an anomaly. "You told me not to leave," Cassie replied, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. "And besides, I wanted to make sure she was okay. She looked so small out there." Roman walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just outside her personal space, the monster hint of his dragon tattoo peeking above the collar of his shirt. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal vest and pulled out a checkbook, the leather soft and dark. With a flick of a fountain pen, he scrawled a number that would have changed Cassie's life 10 times over. He tore the slip of paper away and held it out to her. "For your trouble," he said, his tone clinical. "And for your silence."
Cassie looked at the check.
She saw the zeros, the signature that carried the weight of an empire, and the sheer, arrogant expectation in Roman's eyes. This was the transaction he understood. This was how he managed the world, by putting a price on everything and paying it in full. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a visceral, raw vulnerability that made Roman's hand falter. "I didn't stop because I wanted money," she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge of pride. "I stopped because she was dying. I stayed because I didn't want her to be alone in the dark. You can keep your paper, Mr. Volkov. I just want to know if I can wash my hands." Roman froze. The check remained suspended in the air between them, a bridge to nowhere. In his world, everyone had a price. Loyalty was bought, silence was leased, and life was a series of balanced ledgers. But as he looked into Cassie's eyes, he saw a purity that bypassed his logic entirely. She had risked her life on a high-speed highway, faced his armored SUVs, and stepped into his den of lions, not for a payday, but for a stranger's heartbeat. She had saved his mother out of pure, unadulterated humanity. A sudden, violent jolt went through Roman's chest. It was a sensation more jarring than the phone call, a crazy spark of something he couldn't name. It was an obsessive frenzy, a primitive realization that he was looking at something he couldn't manufacture, buy, or steal. He looked at the blood on her skin, his mother's blood, and felt a dark, overwhelming surge of possessiveness. He didn't want to pay her anymore. He wanted to own the light she carried. With a slow, deliberate motion, Roman crumpled the check into a ball and dropped it onto the floor. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her completely, his presence radiating a heat that made the air in the room feel thick. "You want to wash your hands," he murmured, his voice dropping to a register that was almost a caress. "Fine." He reached out, his large, calloused hand closing around her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He didn't lead her to the guest bathroom or calls a maid to assist her. He led her to his private washroom, a sanctuary of black marble and gold fixtures. He turned on the water, testing the temperature until it was perfect, and then he pulled her hands under the stream. He didn't let go. He took a bar of sandalwood soap and began to lather her skin himself, his thumbs tracing the fine bones of her hands, washing away the crimson stains of the highway. He was meticulous, his touch feverish and focused, as if he were performing a ritual. Cassie watched him, her breath catching in her throat. She expected a monster, but she found a man who was looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. The obsession in his gaze was terrifying, a silent vow that the accidental hero would never walk back into the cold streets again. "You saved the only thing I loved," Roman whispered, his eyes locking onto hers through the mirror's reflection. "You don't get a check for that, Cassie Miller. You get me." He dried her hands with a silk towel, his gaze never wavering. The golden debt had been established, and as Roman looked at the pure soul he had just brought into his fortress, he knew he was never going to let her go. The madness had officially begun. The air in the control center of the Obsidian Fortress was thick with the hum of high-end servers and the frantic, rhythmic tapping of keys. Roman Volkov stood at the center of the room, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the dark, intricate ink of the dragons that seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. His hazel eyes were fixed on the wall of monitors, replaying the grainy thermal footage from the countryside estate. "Run it again," Roman commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the technician beside him flinch. "Sir, we've scrubbed the footage 10 times. The jammer was internal. It didn't just bypass the encryption. It lived inside it." Roman's jaw tightened. He wasn't looking at the footage anymore. He was looking at the betrayal hidden in the code. A jammer of that sophistication wasn't something an outside syndicate could plant. It was a ghost in the machine, placed by someone who knew the heartbeat of the Volkov Empire. The heavy steel doors of the control center hissed open. Viktor, Roman's second-in-command and his most trusted ally for over a decade, stepped into the room. He looked every bit the loyal lieutenant, hair perfectly slicked, suit charcoal and sharp, his face a mask of practiced concern. "The strike teams are ready, Roman," Viktor said, his voice smooth and steady. "We've traced the black SUV to a chop shop in the north. We can burn them out by sunrise. We just need your word." Roman didn't turn around. He watched Viktor's reflection in the dark glass of the monitors. He saw the way Viktor's hand drifted toward his pocket, a subtle, nervous tick that only Roman would notice. They had fought side by side in the gutters of Bisusin. Roman knew the man's soul, or at least he thought he did. "The North Side didn't do this, Viktor," Roman said, his tone deceptively calm. Viktor paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then who? Who else has the balls to touch your mother?" "Someone who wanted me distracted," Roman whispered, finally turning to face him. The monster, hint of the tattoo at his neck seemed to darken. "Someone who knew that if Lydia was bleeding on a highway, I would pull every guard, every sniper, and every dollar away from the dockside merger to find her. Someone who wanted the keys to the kingdom while the king was busy grieving." The silence in the room became absolute. The technicians froze, their eyes glued to their screens, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from controlled lethality to an imminent explosion. "That's a heavy accusation, Roman," Viktor said, his voice dropping an octave. "Who do you think has that kind of access?" "Only one person," Roman replied, stepping into Viktor's space. He leaned in close, his height overwhelming the smaller man. Only one person knew that the high-security transport route was changed at the last second. Only one person had the override codes to the medical pendant's GPS. Roman's hand moved with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached for Viktor's throat, his fingers closing like a vice around the man's windpipe. He slammed him back against the cold glass of the monitor wall, the screens flickering with static at the impact. "You dumped her like a piece of trash," Roman growled, the suppressed panic of the night finally transforming into a jagged, manic rage. "You used my mother, the woman who fed you when you were a gutter rat, as a decoy for your pathetic coup." Viktor clawed at Roman's hand, his face turning a bruised purple. She wasn't supposed to get hurt," he wheezed, the confession spilling out in a desperate gasp. Just a delay to sign the merger. We would have found her. A maid found her. Roman spat, his grip tightening until the glass behind Viktor began to spiderweb. A girl with nothing found the treasure you threw away. You didn't just betray the syndicate, Viktor. You betrayed the blood. Roman felt a crazy surge of clarity. The discovery of the rat in his ranks didn't just make him angry. It fueled the obsessive frenzy he felt toward Cassie Miller. She was the only clean thing in a world of filth. She was the miracle that had survived the trap set by his own brother-in-arms. He leaned in, his forehead touching Viktor's, his hazel eyes burning with a lethal promise. I was going to give you the north side, Viktor. I was going to make you a king beside me. Roman, please. But you touched my anchor, Roman whispered. And now, I'm going to make sure the city forgets you ever had a name. Roman didn't kill him there. That would be too quick. He signaled the guards, who moved in with a silent, terrifying efficiency. As they dragged Viktor toward the sublevels of the Obsidian Fortress, Roman stood alone in the center of the room, his chest heaving. The war had officially moved inside his walls. He turned back to the monitor, but he wasn't looking at the betrayal anymore. He was looking at the security feed of the guest wing, where a poor maid in a ruined apron was sleeping fitfully beside his mother's bed. He had a kingdom to purge, but first, he had a miracle to protect. The Obsidian Fortress was no longer a silent sanctuary. It had become a hive of low-frequency vibrations and the rhythmic heavy boots of men preparing for a purge. In the East Wing medical suite, however, the air remained unnervingly still, smelling of sterile ozone and the faint, earthy scent of the sandalwood soap Roman had used on Cassie's hands. Lydia lay motionless under the soft glow of the vitals monitor, her breathing assisted by a rhythmic hiss that served as the room's only heartbeat. Cassie sat in the chair beside her, her small frame swallowed by the shadows. She had refused the guest room. She had refused the silk robe the house staff had offered. She sat in her ruined maid's uniform, her eyes fixed on the woman she had dragged back from the edge of the asphalt. The heavy oak doors creaked open, but it wasn't Roman who entered. 3 men, members of the Syndicate Council's elite security detail, stepped into the room. They didn't move with Roman's controlled lethality. They moved with the arrogant, heavy-handed entitlement of men who believed everything in this house was a commodity to be managed. The lead man, a brute with a neck like a bull and eyes that held no light, stopped at the foot of Lydia's bed. The girl needs to leave, he barked, his voice a jagged intrusion into the room's sanctity. This is a secure medical zone. Outside now. Cassie didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at first. Her fingers were curled around Lydia's hand, a connection she wasn't ready to break. She's stable, but she's not alone, Cassie said, her voice quiet but carrying a surprising, steely weight. I promised her I'd stay until she woke up. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. You're a maid who got lucky on a highway. You don't make promises in a house like this. You're a liability, and we don't like witnesses. Move or we'll move you. He reached out, his hand, large and calloused, gripping the back of Cassie's chair to yank it away. Cassie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against a marble with a shrill cry.
She didn't retreat.
She stepped between the brute and the bed, her height barely reaching his chest, her pale face etched with a visceral, raw vulnerability that had sharpened into a weapon. I am the only person who stayed when the world was roaring past her, Cassie whispered, her eyes flashing with a fierce, reckless courage. I am the only reason she's breathing. If you want her alone, you'll have to go through me, and I don't think Mr. Volkov would appreciate you touching the only thing he has left to trust. In the high-security surveillance hub 3 floors below, Roman Volkov sat in a high-backed leather chair, his hazel eyes fixed on the primary monitor. He watched the scene in the medical suite with an intensity that bordered on religious. He saw the way Cassie stood her ground, a lamb facing wolves, and he felt a surge of obsessive frenzy that made his own pulse roar in his ears. He had spent 15 years surrounding himself with men who were paid to be brave. He had bought loyalty with blood and gold. But he had never seen anything like this. Cassie Miller had no weapon, No rank and no reason to stay, yet she was standing in the mouth of a dragon's den to protect a woman she barely knew. Roman leaned forward, his hands clenching the armrests until the leather groaned. He watched the way the light caught the messy strands of her hair and the stubborn set of her shoulders. She was the accidental hero, the pure soul he had brought into his obsidian world, and seeing her defy his own syndicate made him feel a dark, manic joy. He reached for the intercom, his thumb hovering over the button to end the confrontation with a single word. But he paused. He wanted to see it. He wanted to memorize the sight of her bravery, to drink in the fact that this girl, this poor maid, was more of a titan than any man in his employ. "Look at her," Roman murmured to the empty room, his voice thick with a possessive, mesmerized wonder. On the screen, the brute took a step closer to Cassie, his hand raised to strike. Roman didn't wait any longer. He pressed the button, his voice cutting through the medical suite like a lightning bolt. "Touch her." Roman's voice boomed through the hidden speakers, "and I will ensure you spend the rest of your very short life wishing the highway had taken you instead." The men in the room froze. They looked at the cameras, their faces draining of color. Roman watched as Cassie didn't look at the cameras or the men. She simply sat back down, her hand finding Lydia's again, her shoulders finally dropping an inch as she returned to her vigil. Roman sat back in the dark of the hub, his chest heaving. The controlled lethality he had built his legend on was unraveling, replaced by a madness he no longer wanted to escape. He had a syndicate to burn, but as he watched Cassie Miller through the cold glass of the monitor, he knew he had found something far more important than a throne. He had found his miracle, and he was going to drive the whole world crazy to keep her. The adrenaline that had sustained Cassie through the highway rescue and the standoff in the medical suite finally dissolved, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The Obsidian Fortress was silent now, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. Driven by a primal need for normalcy, Cassie had wandered into the sprawling, industrial kitchen. It was a cathedral of brushed steel and black granite, too large and too clean to feel like a place where anyone actually ate. She stood by the massive island, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the image of Lydia on the asphalt, the way the headlights had cut through the dark and the terrifying, wet sound of her breathing, hit Cassie with the force of a physical blow. A jagged sob escaped her throat, followed by another. She collapsed into herself, burying her face in her hands. She wasn't just crying for the night's horrors. She was crying for the sheer, overwhelming weight of being trapped in a world where blood was the primary currency. She didn't hear the door slide open. In this house, death and the master of it moved without a sound. The tears don't suit the woman who stood down a syndicate brute. A low, resonant voice vibrated through the room. Cassie gasped, spinning around. Roman Volkov stood in the doorway, his silhouette a sharp, dark edge against the dim moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had shed his tailored vest, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and the sleeves rolled tight against his forearms. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a predator who had just finished a hunt. I didn't hear you," Cassie stammered, frantically wiping her eyes with her sleeves, but the tears wouldn't stop. "I'm sorry. I'll go back to the room." Roman didn't let her move. He crossed the distance between them with a slow, deliberate gait that made the air in the kitchen feel thick and charged. He stopped inches away, his presence radiating a heat that felt like a furnace in the cold room. "Don't apologize for being human, Cassie Miller," he whispered. "It's a rare enough thing in these walls." He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving with a gentleness that felt almost dangerous. He didn't pull her into a conventional embrace. Instead, he rested his palm against the back of her neck, his fingers threading into the messy, loose strands of her hair. The contact was electric. Cassie's breath hitched as she looked up at him. From this close, she could see the monster, hint in its full, terrifying glory. The dark, jagged ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck and upper chest seemed to writhe as his muscles shifted. It was a map of 1,000 violences, a visual history of a man who had survived by becoming the thing others feared. And yet, His eyes, those piercing, hazel depths, were filled with a suppressed panic that mirrored her own. "You're shaking," Roman noted, his voice dropping to a dark, gravelly rasp. I've never seen so much blood," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Everything is so cold here, Mr. Volkov. Even the air feels like it wants to cut me." In a sudden, fluid motion, Roman pulled her forward, closing the final inch of space. He didn't hide the ink, he pressed her against it. Cassie's cheek came to rest against his collarbone, her soft, tear-stained skin meeting the rough, raised lines of the dragon tattoo. The collision was absolute. She was the raw vulnerability of the street, and he was the lethal ink of the underworld, two worlds that were never meant to touch, now fused together in the dark. Roman's heart thundered against her ear, a violent, rhythmic drumming that told her he was far from the clinical machine he pretended to be. He wrapped his other arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard frame, his grip possessive and feverish. He felt a crazy surge of protective frenzy. This girl, this maid who had saved his mother, was now the only thing keeping him from drifting into total darkness. "The air won't cut you as long as I'm breathing," Roman murmured into her hair, his touch becoming obsessive, his hand sliding down her spine to anchor her to him. "You saved the anchor of my life. In return, I will be the walls that keep the world out." Cassie didn't pull away. The lethal ink of his skin felt warm, the only warm thing she had found since she pulled over on the highway. She let her eyes close, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco, surrendering to the madness. She had expected a monster, and perhaps he was one, but as he held her in the silent kitchen, she realized that even a monster could be a sanctuary. The first night had begun with a distress call, but it was ending with a bond written in skin and shadow, a collision that neither of them would ever be able to undo. The silence of the Obsidian Fortress didn't break, it shattered. It began with the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of the perimeter alarms being bypassed, followed by the dull, muffled thud of a breaching charge against the West Wing service entrance. Inside the master suite, the lights flickered and died, plunged into a preternatural darkness that was immediately cut by the sweeping red beams of emergency backup power. Roman was moving before the first echo of the explosion had faded. He didn't reach for a panic room lever. He reached for Cassie. He found her in the dim, crimson light, her eyes wide and dark with a visceral vulnerability that sent a fresh jolt of crazy adrenaline through his veins. Beside her, Lydia stirred in her medical bed, her fragile hand reaching out into the void. "Stay behind the reinforced glass of the medical bay," Roman commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Do not move. Do not breathe until I come back for you." "Roman, they're inside," Cassie whispered, her voice trembling but her hands steady as she helped Lydia into a more secure position. Roman didn't answer. He shed his dress shirt, the silk falling to the floor to reveal the lethal ink of the dragons coiled across his back and chest. In the pulsing red light, the tattoos seemed to come alive, a predatory map of a man who was no longer a CEO, but a wolf reclaiming his territory. He pulled a serrated blade from a hidden compartment in the wall and checked the slide on his suppressed handgun. There was no fear in his eyes, only a dark, obsessive joy. The traitors had come to finish what they started on the highway. They had come for the treasure and the miracle, and in doing so, they had given Roman the one thing he had been craving since the betrayal: permission to be a monster. He stepped out into the corridor just as the first wave of charcoal-suited men rounded the corner. They weren't strangers. These were men he had trained, men who had eaten at his table. "Roman, it's over. Give us the woman and the old lady, and we—" Roman didn't let him finish. He moved with a speed that defied his silver fox elegance, a blur of muscle and ink. The controlled lethality was gone, replaced by a manic, predatory frenzy. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. He bypassed their guards with a jagged, fluid grace, his blade finding the gaps in their armor with a sickening precision. He felt overjoyed by the carnage. Every drop of blood that hit the obsidian floor was a payment for the terror they had put in Cassie's eyes. Every groan of a dying traitor was a tribute to the mother they had dumped on the asphalt. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed through the hall, a sound of a man who had finally found his religion in the ruin of his enemies. "Is that all?" Roman roared, his voice bouncing off the dark glass walls. He stood in the center of the hallway, his chest heaving, his skin slick with sweat and the evidence of his work. The red light caught the glint of his eyes, making them look like twin embers. "You came into my house to touch my miracles? You thought I was a businessman?" A second wave of attackers surged forward, fueled by desperation. Roman met them head-on, his movements becoming more erratic and terrifying. He used the environment like a weapon, slamming heads into marble pillars and using the very shadows to mask his position. He was a force of nature, a dragon protecting its horde. He wasn't thinking about the syndicate or the merger. He was thinking about the girl in the apron and the woman in the bed. They were his only anchors, and he would burn the world to keep them grounded. In the medical suite, Cassie watched the shadows dance through the frosted glass. She heard the wet thuds, the guttural screams, and the manic laughter of the man who had promised to be her shield. She felt the raw, visceral terror of the situation, but beneath it was a strange, haunting certainty. Roman wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for her. When the last of the traitors fell, the silence returned, but it was heavy and metallic. The door to the medical bay hissed open and Roman stepped in. He was a vision of absolute violence, his silver hair disheveled and his body marked by the struggle. He looked crazy. A man pushed past the brink of sanity, but the moment his eyes landed on Cassie, the predatory light softened. He dropped the blade, the metal clattering against the floor. He didn't care about the bodies in the hall or the war he had just escalated. He walked to Cassie, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch her cheek, leaving a faint, dark smear on her pale skin. "They're gone," he rasped, his voice thick with a possessive, feverish hunger. "I told you. The air won't cut you as long as I'm breathing." Cassie looked at the lethal ink of his chest, then up at his wild, hazel eyes. She saw the monster, and she saw the protector, and in the red glow of the failing lights, she realized she no longer knew where one ended and the other began. The night of red snow had claimed his soul, but it had also cemented his obsession. He was her prison and her king, and as he pulled her into a fierce, blood-stained embrace, she knew the madness was now their only home. The morning that followed the night of red snow didn't bring peace. It brought a cold, absolute clarity. The sun rose over Bususin like a pale, distant eye, casting long shadows across the obsidian floors of the fortress. The air was no longer thick with the scent of gunpowder and ozone, but with the sterile, sharp aroma of industrial cleaners and the unmistakable, heavy silence of a kingdom that had been purged. Roman Volkov stood on the expansive terrace of the penthouse, his silhouette a dark, jagged mark against the dawn. He had showered away the evidence of the battle, but the manic intensity in his hazel eyes remained. He wore a fresh black shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the dragon ink that now seemed etched into his very soul. Below him, the city was waking up, unaware that the hierarchy of its underworld had been dismantled and rebuilt in a single night. He turned as the glass doors slid open. Cassie stepped onto the terrace, looking small and fragile in the vastness of the obsidian world. She was no longer wearing the stained maid's apron. She was wrapped in a robe of heavy, midnight blue silk that Roman had personally placed in her room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the lingering shock of the violence she had witnessed, but her gaze was steady as it met his. Behind her, the medical monitors in the east wing hummed a steady, healthy rhythm. Lydia had woken up an hour ago, her first words a whispered inquiry for the girl who had held her hand on the highway. "The traitors are gone, Cassie," Roman said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that carried the finality of a gavel. "Every man who touched that transport route, every shadow that moved against my mother, they have been erased. There is no longer a North Side or a council. There is only the Volkov name and the peace I have bought with their silence." He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory, until he was standing close enough to shield her from the morning wind. He didn't look at her with a clinical detachment of a boss. He looked at her with a raw, obsessive frenzy that made the air between them feel electric. "You asked me once if you were free," Roman whispered, his large, calloused hand reaching out to tilt her chin upward. "You asked if the transaction was over." Cassie's breath hitched. "Is it?" "The transaction never existed," Roman replied, his eyes darkening with a fierce, frightening promise. "A transaction is for property. It's for territory and shipping lanes. You are the soul of this empire now. You are the miracle that walked out of the dark and saved the only thing I loved. You saved me from becoming the monster I was supposed to be." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. "You are no longer a maid, Cassie Miller. You will never again kneel in the dirt or wait for a paycheck from people who don't know your name. From this moment on, your name is the law in this city. My men will answer to you. My resources will be your playground. And I." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ghosting over her lips. The lethal ink of his skin felt like a furnace against her own. "I am your eternal shield," he vowed, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "I will be the walls that the world cannot climb. I will be the madness that keeps you safe. You gave me back my mother, and in return, I give you a life where the air will never cut you again." Cassie looked up into the winter storm of his eyes. She saw the silver fox titan, the monster with the dragon ink, and the man who was terrified of a world without her. She realized then that she hadn't just been rescued, she had been claimed. The highway had been a precipice, and Roman Volkov was the fall she was finally ready to take. "I didn't ask for a kingdom, Roman," she whispered, her hand rising to rest over the thundering heartbeat beneath his ink. "I know," he murmured, his grip on her waist tightening until the collision was absolute. "That's why you're the only one I can trust to rule it beside me." As the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the Obsidian Fortress with a blinding, golden light, the king's new order was established. The accidental hero had become the queen of the shadows, and as Roman pulled her into a possessive, final embrace, the madness of the night was replaced by a devotion that would burn long after the city turned to ash. The story of the boss and the maid was over. The legend of the shield and the soul had just begun. The central theme is that true human goodness is a force that even the most powerful cannot manufacture or buy. Cassie, a poor maid with zero societal status, possesses a level of selfless compassion that Roman's billions couldn't secure. Her decision to stop on a dangerous highway for a stranger proves that genuine empathy is the highest form of human currency, capable of stopping a dragon in his tracks. Roman lives in a world where everything is a transaction, loyalty is bought, and silence is a line item in a budget. When Cassie rejects his check, she shatters his cynical worldview. The story teaches that integrity is doing the right thing when there is no reward, and that the most valuable acts are those performed without an invoice attached. Roman undergoes a transformation from a man who uses controlled lethality for profit to a man who uses his absolute protection for a purpose. The moral here is that true power is not the ability to exploit others, but the will to shield the vulnerable. Roman's new order is built not on fear, but on his responsibility to protect the miracles, Lydia and Cassie, in his life. Viktor, the second in command, represents the moral failure of using people as distractions or tools for self-gain. By treating Lydia as a sacrificial pawn, he loses everything: his status, his brotherhood, and his future. The story warns that betraying those you are meant to protect for the sake of ambition is a debt that the universe eventually collects in full. Cassie's maid's courage highlights that bravery isn't reserved for those with weapons or titles. Despite her visceral vulnerability, she stands down trained assassins to stay by Lydia's side. This teaches that courage is found in the moment you refuse to look away from someone in need, regardless of how small or powerless you think you are. The story ultimately posits that the world's darkness cannot extinguish a single light of pure intent. While Roman provides the Obsidian Fortress for protection, it is Cassie's highway angel spirit that gives that fortress a soul worth defending.